A 15-year-old boy hacked into NASA. He downloaded source code worth $1.7 million, and the US government took notice. This isn't just a story about hacking. It's about a brilliant mind, a government crackdown, and a tragic ending that shook the tech world. In this video, we explore how Jonathan James, a teenage prodigy, used basic tools and brilliant logic to breach the US cyber walls, and how it all came crashing down. Chapter 1. Digital Wunderkind. Jonathan grew up in South Florida. His dad was a computer programmer. Instead of cartoons, Jonathan played with C++ books and command line prompts. At his father's workstation, he'd watch for hours as green text scrolled across black screens, fascinated by the power hidden in those cryptic commands. At age 6, he was already reverse engineering video games. By 13, he was coding in assembly and experimenting with Linux kernels. When his school installed a new network system, Jonathan found 7 security holes in the first week and reported none of them. He wasn't just clicking buttons. Jonathan was learning how operating systems talk to hardware at the most fundamental level. He understood buffer overflows, where programs write beyond allocated memory spaces, creating exploitable vulnerabilities. In one school project, he demonstrated a stack smashing technique that could give him complete control of the school's grading database. He mastered system daemons, those invisible background processes handling everything from network services to hardware monitoring. Most shocking of all, he could identify and execute zero-day exploits of undiscovered vulnerabilities with no existing patches. In 1998, he found and exploited a vulnerability in Solaris Unix that wouldn't be officially discovered by security reachers for another 8 months. His parents tried to stop him by setting limits, but like any hacker story, restrictions only made him more curious. When they took his computer away, he ran away from home, refusing to return until they gave him back his digital access. What his parents didn't know, he'd already built a hidden backup computer using parts salvaged from his school's recycling bin, which he kept at a friend's house. Jonathan wasn't just evading parental controls, he was systematically building his shadow infrastructure. For Jonathan, hacking wasn't about financial gain or malicious intent. In a rare interview he gave in 2001, he explained his motivation. "You can control all these computers from the government, the military, large corporations, and if you know what you're doing, you can travel through the internet at your will with no restrictions. That's power." In a world where teenagers often feel powerless, Jonathan found a realm where his intelligence gave him control and respect. A psychologist who later analyzed his case noted that Jonathan showed classic signs of what experts now call digital self-actualization, finding identity and purpose through technological mastery. Chapter 2. The First Breaches. By age 14, Jonathan had moved beyond simply exploring computer systems. His online persona Comrade became known in the underground forums where hackers shared techniques and targets. Unlike many peers who bragged about their exploits, Jonathan was methodical and quiet, keeping detailed handwritten logs of vulnerabilities he'd discovered. Sometimes sending anonymous tips to system administrators, most never bothered to fix the problems he identified. In 1999, Jonathan breached BellSouth, a major telecom. He used a simple technique called packet sniffing, intercepting data being transferred on a network. What's truly astonishing is that he did this using a Pentium 266 MHz computer, a machine considered obsolete even then, proving that ingenuity trumps hardware. Think of it like listening on someone else's phone call. With tools like TCP dump and Ethereal, which is now Wireshark, he could see admin credentials flying through the wires unencrypted. The truly shocking part? BellSouth's network administrators had disabled encryption protocols to improve performance, essentially sending passwords as plain text. Jonathan's homemade sniffing algorithm could filter through millions of packets to find authentication strings, catching an average of 40 admin passwords per hour. Security experts later revealed that Jonathan's code was more efficient than commercial sniffing tools costing thousands of dollars. While most teens worried about their grades, Jonathan simply changed his. He penetrated the Miami-Dade school network, gaining access to the grading system and admin databases. What school officials never discovered, Jonathan didn't just alter his own grades, he fixed mathematical errors in the grading algorithm that had been unfairly penalizing students in certain subjects. A later audit would attribute this fix to a software update. Jonathan had essentially performed free IT work for the district while committing a federal crime. Success breeds confidence, and Jonathan's ambitions grew. By mid-1999, he'd set his sights on more challenging and risky targets. He began systematically probing government networks, looking for weaknesses. What made his approach unusual was his methodology. Rather than using automated scanning tools that might trigger alarms, Jonathan manually inspected network structures, patiently mapping out the digital landscape over weeks before making any moves. One security expert would later describe his technique as digital reconnaissance at its finest, a level of patience rare among teenage hackers. Chapter 3: Pentagon Infiltration. Next, he breached the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the DTRA, gaining access to hundreds of emails, passwords, and usernames. But here's what few people know. Before targeting these agencies, Jonathan sent anonymous emails warning about their security vulnerabilities. They were ignored. One DTRA administrator even deleted Jonathan's warning because he thought it was spam. Inside the DTRA systems, Jonathan discovered unencrypted documents discussing nuclear inspection protocols, information that foreign adversaries would have paid millions to acquire, yet he never downloaded or shared these files. Jonathan later admitted to authorities that he had installed an unauthorized backdoor in a computer server in Dulles, Virginia. This backdoor allowed him to install a sniffer that intercepted over 3,000 messages passing between the DTRA employees, capturing credentials that gave him deeper access to military systems. What made this technique so effective was its simplicity. The backdoor was essentially hiding in plain sight, mimicking a standard system process so perfectly that it appeared in a task list as a legitimate service. When military cybersecurity teams finally detected unusual activity, they initially suspected a foreign state actor, not a teenager in Florida. They activated a rarely used protocol called Byzantine Hades, a high-level response typically reserved for sophisticated nation-state attacks. For 2 weeks, intelligence analysts worked around the clock tracking the intrusions, involving specialists from the NSA and newly formed cyber warfare units. The revelation that their adversary was a high school student was met with both embarrassment and concern for the implications for national security. The extent of Jonathan's access remains classified to this day, but court documents revealed that he had obtained login credentials for at least 13 different military systems across 3 branches of service. One senior defense official, speaking anonymously years later, admitted if he had been working for a foreign intelligence service, it would have been a catastrophic breach. Jonathan's motivations, however, remained purely exploratory, driven by curiosity rather than any desire to harm American interests. Chapter 4: The NASA Hack. On June 29, 1999, while scanning networks for vulnerabilities, Jonathan discovered a server in Huntsville, Alabama. This wasn't just any server. It belonged to NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, which develops and tests rocket engines and creates software for the International Space Station. Using a vulnerability scanner he had coded himself, Jonathan identified a critical flaw in how the server handled certain types of requests. The most surprising element? This vulnerability had been patched in newer versions of the software, but NASA had delayed updates due to compatibility concerns with older systems, a decision that would prove costly. Jonathan exploited a backdoor in a Solaris Unix system at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. Once inside, he downloaded code for the International Space Station's life support software worth $1.7 million. The exploit targeted a vulnerability in the Remote Procedure Call (RPC) services running on port 111, allowing him to execute commands with root privileges without authentication. The most alarming discovery? This NASA server was connected to 13 other systems using shared trust relationships, meaning once he compromised one machine, he effectively had keys to the entire network. Even more disturbing, the default administrator password hadn't been changed from its factory setting of password 1. Among the files Jonathan downloaded was something extraordinarily sensitive: source code for the International Space Station's life support systems. This software controlled critical environmental elements in the living quarters of the ISS, including temperature and humidity regulation systems, literally keeping the astronauts alive in the hostile environment of space. What made this breach particularly concerning was the timing. The first ISS modules had just launched months earlier, and astronauts were preparing for their initial long-duration stays. NASA had to shut down its network for 3 weeks, costing them $41,000 in damages. This software that Jonathan accessed controlled critical environmental functions inside the ISS living quarters. What NASA didn't publicly disclose, engineers had to completely rewrite portions of the code because they couldn't be certain what had been altered. For 5 tense days, astronauts had to manually monitor life support systems while the software was being patched. NASA's internal response was far more panicked than they publicly admitted. According to a former security administrator who spoke on the condition of anonymity, emergency meetings were held at Johnson Space Center to determine if the ISS life support compromise required bringing astronauts home early. Chapter 5: Caught in the Net. The FBI's cybercrime unit assigned 12 agents to track down Jonathan, an unprecedented allocation of resources for hacking at the time. Using sophisticated traffic analysis, they traced his digital footprints through 7 countries and dozens of proxy servers. The most surprising aspect of the investigation, Jonathan had been under surveillance for nearly 3 months before his arrest. Agents had remotely accessed his computer's webcam and microphone, watching him as he hacked government systems in real time. This surveillance was later deemed legally questionable by the court, which is partly why his initial sentence was relatively lenient. On the 26th of January 2000, just weeks after Jonathan had turned 16, agents raided his family's home in Pinecrest, confiscating his computers and questioning the teenage hacker. FBI agents were shocked when they raided his home, expecting sophisticated equipment. They instead found a bedroom with Star Wars posters, a basic desktop computer, and hundreds of handwritten notes documenting system vulnerabilities. During the raid, Jonathan kept asking for specific legal documentation that surprised the agents, showing a sophisticated understanding of search warrant limitations that even seasoned criminals rarely possess. Because of his age and cooperation with authorities, Jonathan initially received a relatively lenient sentence: 7 months of house arrest followed by probation until his 18th birthday. He was also required to write letters of apology to NASA and the Department of Defense, and was banned from using computers for recreational purposes. The case made headlines across the country. Attorney General Janet Reno and prosecuting attorney Guy Lewis issued statements claiming Jonathan's case demonstrated the Justice Department's willingness to get tough on juvenile cyber offenders. At just 16, he was the youngest person ever convicted for a federal cybercrime. Had he been an adult, legal experts estimated he could have faced at least 10 years in prison. What made this case unprecedented, the Department of Justice assigned 6 senior prosecutors, the same team size typically reserved for major organized crime cases. Attorney General Janet Reno personally reviewed the case file, recognizing it would establish precedent for all future juvenile hacking cases. Chapter 6: From House Arrest to Prison. Jonathan's story took another turn when he violated his probation by testing positive for drug use. The court responded by sentencing him to 6 months in a federal correctional facility in Alabama. For a 16-year-old whose life revolved around technology, prison represented not just the loss of freedom, but a complete severance from his digital identity. What few people know, during his detentions, corrections officers would secretly bring him confiscated phones to inspect for contraband, unwittingly giving the convicted hacker access to mobile devices capable of connecting to the internet. One officer later admitted, "We knew he understood these devices better than anyone on staff. We just didn't think about the security implications." Behind the technical jargon and legal proceedings was a troubled young man struggling to find his place. Jonathan's father later revealed that his son had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder in his teens, but never received consistent treatment. The most disturbing revelation? In a sealed psychiatric evaluation performed during his detention, doctors warned that Jonathan showed signs of severe depression that required immediate intervention, warnings that were filed away and never acted upon. After serving his sentence, Jonathan tried to rebuild his life away from hacking in the public eye. He returned to his parents' home in Pinecrest and attempted to maintain a low profile. However, the stigma of being America's first juvenile hacker sent to prison followed him, making it difficult to separate from his past. Job applications were rejected once potential employers discovered his history, and college admission committees viewed his applications with suspicion despite his exceptional technical abilities. Chapter 7: The TJX Connection. In 2007, the TJX hack compromised over 45 million credit cards. The Secret Service suspected Jonathan. He denied everything. The breach was massive, affecting TJ Maxx, Marshalls, Home Goods, and other retailers under the TJX company's umbrella. The most disturbing part? TJX had been warned about their vulnerable wireless networks 3 years earlier by security consultants, but executives decided fixing the vulnerabilities were too expensive, a decision that would ultimately cost them over $200 million in damages. The fact that led investigators to be suspicious of James was an unknown hacker collaborating with the mastermind Albert Gonzalez, who used the pseudonym JJ. The initials coincided with Jonathan James, which was enough for the Secret Service to obtain search warrants. During the investigation, an unnamed co-conspirator with the initials JJ came to light, leading authorities once again to Jonathan James' doorstep. While the actual TJX mastermind was later identified as Albert Gonzalez, Jonathan's prior history made him an easy target. The truly ingenious part of the attack? Gonzalez's team didn't break encryption. They captured data during the brief milliseconds when it was being decrypted by the payment processing software. They also created an elaborate data exfiltration network using a sophisticated chain of proxy servers that bounced stolen data through Turkey, Latvia, and Ukraine before reaching drop servers in Belarus and Russia. The most shocking revelation? Some of these servers were running on compromised university networks with such high bandwidth that the additional criminal traffic wasn't even noticed. Secret Service agents raided not only Jonathan's residence, but also his brother's and girlfriend's homes, searching for evidence connecting him to the TJX breach. During these raids, they discovered a legally owned firearm and notes indicating James had previously contemplated suicide. Despite their thorough investigation, they found no concrete evidence linking Jonathan to the TJX hack. As it would later be discovered, the JJ investigators sought was likely not Jonathan James at all, but rather Stephen Watt, a close friend of Gonzalez who sometimes used the online alias Jim Jones. Chapter 8: Tragic Conclusion. The pressure of being implicated in a crime he maintained he had nothing to do with took a severe toll on Jonathan's mental health. Friends and family reported that he became increasingly paranoid and depressed, convinced the government would make him a scapegoat for the TJX breach regardless of his actual involvement. Without steady employment and carrying the stigma of his past convictions, Jonathan felt trapped in the system he believed was determined to punish him again. Fearing he'd be scapegoated for a crime he didn't commit, Jonathan took his own life on May 18, 2008, at the age of 24. Investigators later determined the JJ. They were looking for Stephen Watt, who used the alias Jim Jones, not Jonathan James. The tragedy deepens with this revelation. 2 days after Jonathan's suicide, federal prosecutors were preparing to officially clear him of any involvement in the TJX breach. That documentation arrived to his home 4 days after his funeral. His suicide note read, "I honestly had nothing to do with TJX. I have no faith in the justice system." He also wrote, "Remember, it's not whether you win or lose, it's whether I win or lose. And sitting in jail for 20, 10, or even 5 years for a crime I didn't commit is not winning. I die free." These final words reveal a young man who felt cornered by a system he believed would never give him a fair chance, regardless of his actual innocence or guilt. Chapter 9: Legacy and Lessons. Jonathan's case still sparks debate. Should teenage hackers be treated as criminals or as misguided geniuses needing mentorship? His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our justice system, particularly how it handles young, technically skilled offenders. The most damning statistic? Studies show that 70% of convicted hackers who receive mentorship instead of prison never reoffended, while incarceration has a recidivism rate of over 80% for cybercrimes. Today, many of the skills that sent Jonathan to prison are taught in university cybersecurity programs. Bug bounty programs now provide legal avenues for hackers to identify vulnerabilities. Organizations like HackerOne and BugCrowd connect security researchers with companies willing to pay for responsible disclosure of security flaws. Had these existed in Jonathan's time, his story might have ended very differently. A cybersecurity professor put it this way: "We've criminalized the curiosity of an entire generation of computer prodigies before we figured out how to channel their talents productively." What do you think? Was Jonathan a cyber terrorist or a misunderstood genius? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real tech crime stories. We'll be exploring similar cases where brilliant minds found themselves on the wrong side of the digital divide.